Continuing on with these top 10s today, covering the sorceries, and as always the list is based on how useful something is in PvE. So let's just say that there is going to be a really good close range spell, but it's just not as good as another close range spell. I'm probably not going to value it as much, and it's not going to be on this list. But anyway, no need for a long intro today, let's just get into it. Starting off at number 10, COMET AZUR. Now this spell did actually get indirectly nerfed as of patch 1.12. TERRA MAGICA got a nerf from 35% magic damage to 22.5% magic damage. The Cerulean Hidden Tier only lasts 10 seconds now compared to the 15 seconds it used to. And the Jellyfish Shield buff went from a 20% boost to a 12.5% boost. And these things were just extremely useful to pair alongside COMET AZUR because this spell is incredibly slow and very expensive. So it's only going to be good against those bosses that like spawn really far away from you, so you have enough time to get off the spell. And when using the Cerulean Hidden Tier, you're not going to be losing any types of FP for the next 10 seconds. And in that time, if you have enough buffs, you can definitely kill many different types of bosses, or at least get them really weak. So you can just use this to lead off every single boss fight, and a lot of them are going to be shredded. Now since these nerfs, it's no longer going to be as dominant as it once was, although it still can make quick work of a lot of different types of bosses. And for this DLC, there's not going to be many bosses, if any, that actually give you an opening long enough to try and let you get off the entire combo and have it last the whole 10 seconds of the Cerulean Hidden Tier duration. But if you do use things like Spirit Summons that can help you distract, then you can get the entire combo off. And at that point, you can just like melt every single boss. Now, it's still not going to be the most easiest thing to use because you only have like one shot at getting the whole combo off. Otherwise, the Cerulean Hidden Tier buff is going to go away. You can't really aim it much either. It still has higher requirements and it's still going to be a long animation. So it's very situational still. But if you do find those bosses that don't really move around as much, you should definitely use this one. Number 9, RANNI'S Dark Moon. Now this is not meant to be used as a damaging type of option because the damage is not that high. It is a longer cast, does consume 57 FP. However, it does get really good tracking and it goes really far as well. But the whole purpose of this spell is to debuff enemies. When enemies are hit with this spell for the next minute, the magic damage negation gets decreased by 10%. As soon as you spawn into the boss room, you can just hit any single boss at any part of the map very easily with a spell like this, and that's just going to mean just 10% more damage. And specifically with RANNI'S Dark Moon, it actually does do a bunch of frost buildup too. And in some cases, it's not going to instantly proc frost on bosses, but you could just cast one frost-based sorcery like one time, and then it's going to instantly proc frost, and of which that is going to also debuff enemies to make them take 20% even more damage, and that is going to stack with the 10% that the RANNI'S Dark Moon debuff gives. Now this spell is going to have a very high requirements at 68 intelligence, so it's only really going to be meant to use with endgame types of builds, but you only really benefit of using a spell like this. Number 8, Rock Sling. Now, as I always say when designing a build and picking spells, you always want to have stuff for variation. So that means you have like a ranged option, a close option, an AoE spell, and you always want to have different damage types too. You want to have some spells if you go up against magic resist enemies, and Rock Sling is going to be your best physical based spell. So that's the main reason why it is going to be on the top 10, but it is still really good as a spell itself, as it still is a hard hitting projectile for only 18 FP. And if all 3 of those rocks do land, it is going to do roughly 30 stance damage, which is more so than almost any other spell in the game. And it does have really good tracking. As soon as you click the button, those rocks are basically guaranteed. Even if you do get staggered, they're still going to come out. And you can actually pair it alongside the Arrow Reach Talisman. And this thing could be one of the best snipers in the game. Like, this goes incredibly far. And you're doing all this for only 18 FP. Now, I'm still not going to want to use it over things like Night Comet in terms of like just a regular DPS option. But if you did want to like poise break enemies, or if you were fighting enemies weaker to physical or resistant magic, then I would just use this one instead. Now, the most annoying thing about this spell is that the rock on the left, for some reason, just like misses smaller targets in most cases. I don't know why that is. The tracking is just so whack with that left rock. But if you do use it at those further distances, the tracking starts to kick in a little bit better, and it can be a very efficient spell to use. Number 7, Fleeting Microcosm, or some say Microcosm. Now this spell is actually going to be one of the better AoE spells in the game, based on how good the damage is, how large the AoE is, and how far the projectile actually can go. Because it does summon this ball that spawns directly underneath the player, and enemies don't really react to it. Now it does take a little bit to explode, but there is like a little staggering effect just before the explosion that does stun lock those smaller enemies to where like that follow-up attack can be guaranteed, and the whole damage can be really nice. Especially if you pair it alongside the Maternal Staff and the Fingers Robe. These things could just boost the damage by a bunch more. And obviously it's a spell that can be fully charged too, which is just going to mean a bunch more damage, especially with the Godfrey's icon. So any single time that you were going to fight those smaller enemies that can get staggered, you could just use this spell, to just like knock them back and send them flying. Or if you were fighting multiple enemies at once, you could just use this one to just clean them all up at the exact same time. And it is only going to consume 26 FP, which for how much damage that it does do, it definitely is worth it. So yeah, in my opinion, I think this is the best projectile AoE spell that you actually can get with the sorceries. Well, specifically for PvE, and it does beat out things like gravitational missile too. Number 6, TERRA MAGICA. Now yes, this spell did get nerfed as of patch 1.12, went from 35% more magic damage to 22.5% magic damage, but it's still going to make it to a top 10, because it still is going to be the only way you can boost your magic damage reliably with a spell. And 22.5% is still a very large boost. That's more than things like the magic tier and the blood sucking tier. Now the obvious downside is that you do have to be standing inside of that circle just to actually benefit off the damage, which against a lot of types of bosses is not going to be like the most viable option, especially if you're using like closer range types of spells, because you have to constantly keep moving back and forth. And if you try to stay in the circle, it's probably going to get you killed more than not, because you're not really fighting the way that you actually want to fight. But if you have those long range projectiles that are very quick and easy to use, you can just plop this down in a safe location and just keep spamming, and that's just going to mean 22.5% more damage. Number 5, Shard Spiral. Now this is the best sorcery to use in the game that is going to destroy those very large bosses very easily and very reliably. I would not use it against smaller types of targets. You could potentially use it against NPCs because it actually does stun lock pretty nicely, but I think things like Knight's Comet is going to work way better anyway. But any single time that you go up against a really large boss like a dragon or whatnot, just throw on Shard Spiral and just spam, and they're going to die very quickly. There might be other spells like Meteorite Avastel that could probably do it quicker, but that spell requires things like the Cerulean Hidden tier, and it's going to be a lot more risky because it's a very long casting animation, where Shard Spiral, only 14 FP, very quick cast, you can walk while spamming it, and it has decent tracking, which is why it actually works so well against those larger bosses, because it hits multiple times while they're inside of the boss. Number 4, ZAMOR Ice Storm. Any single time that you have an intelligence-based build and you're not using a frost-based weapon, you have to have a frost-based spell, and of which ZAMOR Ice Storm is just the best one in my opinion. Does the most damage, most stance damage, the fastest frost build-up, and now with this DLC, the Enraged Divine Beast and the Divine Beast Helm are going to boost the damage of this, because it is counted as a storm-based attack. That is going to be a short-range AoE spell that can be fully charged. Now, when uncharged, it's not going to do anything too crazy. Does roughly around 300 and something frost build-up, which against some bosses, it is going to instantly proc frost. Does do about 18 stance damage too. But when you have this thing fully charged, it's going to do 700 frost build-up, which that is basically an instant frost proc on like anything in the game, and do it in a decently sized AoE, do amazing damage, do 40 stance damage, and it only consumes 17 FP. Like, this spell is just great even if you didn't want to use it to proc frost. Like, the only and obvious downside is that it does not get hyper armor, so you can get staggered out of it. But if you are surrounded by some enemies and you manage to get the fully charged version off, that is basically just a GG, because all those smaller enemies are going to get stun locked and is instantly procced with frost, which is an amazing status effect to have, because that means just 10% flat damage and a 20% damage debuff to the enemies. Now, if you still did not like the range of the spell and you wanted to proc frost at a distance, Glintstone Icecrag is going to be your next best option, because at those further distances, it's going to proc frost pretty quickly and just do nice damage and have a little bit of tracking. And yes, this is going to be better than Adula's Moonblade too. Adula's Moonblade is only good at closer range, of which ZAMOR Ice Storm just has it beaten. So yeah, any single time you're not using a frost-based weapon, I recommend is putting on ZAMOR Ice Storm and leading off the fight with this. Number 3, CARIAN Slicer, the best R1 spamming weapon in the entire game, except it's actually a spell that consumes 4 FP, which is not even that big of a deal anyway. But yeah, this thing just outputs such stupidly high amounts of DPS. Every single swing just does so much damage for some reason, and it's like really quick. And it has like its own moveset with things like running attacks, jumping attacks. And for only 4 FP, low stamina cost, really quick recovery frames, it's like the least risky close range spell in the entire game. And it's just the best one in terms of DPS too. You get it right at the beginning of the game, only 14 intelligence requirement, and it can carry you from start to finish against any single boss. Now, the only reason why it's not going to get to number 1 is because you still have to be at closer range, so you still have to like actually dodge enemies' movesets and actually be in the heat of battle, whereas like if you're using projectile attacks, you can just be far away from everything else and not have to really engage with an enemy, which projectile attacks just cheese the entire game. But you can quite literally use CARIAN Slicer as a weapon replacement, because it is just better than almost every single weapon in the game. Number 2, Night Comet, which is a spell that just goes really far, can be casted over and over again, and is output really high DPS. Now, it's not going to be doing as much damage as regular Comet, so that one might just be better for DPS, but this thing actually has 3 things going for it that regular Comet does not. 1, it is cheaper. It is only 21 FP. 2, it actually can be boosted by a staff. Regular Comet doesn't actually get a staff to boost the damage, whereas for this spell, you can put the staff or the loss in your offhand and get 30% more damage, which in that instance, it's just going to be doing more damage than regular Comet. And best of all yet, enemies do not see it. This spell is invisible, so they're just not going to dodge it, input read it, parry it, whatever it may be. They're just going to eat it right to the face and not dodge it a single time. So it is just one of the most brain dead spells in the entire game. You just like spam R1 at a distance every single time, and it's just going to do amazing damage and just shred bosses really quickly. So when it comes to like a single target projectile option, it's not going to get much better than Knight's Comet. Number 1, Impenetrable Thorns. I'm sure to nobody's surprise, yeah, this is the best sorcery in the game with a pure faith requirement. But this spell is just utterly broken. It's going to get nerfed, so use it while you can. It's a thorn-based sorcery, which does pure magic damage and actually does get boosted by the Staff of the Guilty. Goes incredibly far, like I mean stupidly far, has really good tracking, does insane damage, and does upwards of 400 blood loss build-up. And when you pair it alongside some arcane based of staffs, like the Maternal Staff or the Albinuric Staff, you could do upwards of like 1500 bleed, which is just stupid. And that's combined with like the ridiculous damage that you can do with the spell itself, because if you are at those closer ranges, all those projectile attacks are just going to explode at the exact same time, and then everything just dies. And you can cast it over and over again very quickly for only 15 FP. It is going to drain a little bit of your health, but it's only 50 HP, and by the time that you actually get this spell well into the DLC, you're going to have large amounts of health. 50 HP is like not a big deal, especially because you're almost one-shotting every single boss and enemy while you're using it anyway. So yeah, as long as you have a staff and 24 faith, doesn't really matter what staff that you use, just spec into like some magic boosting things, or don't even do that, just like spam the spell and I guarantee you'll find plenty of success. Anyway, that is the ranking now done. Just let me know what your opinions are down in the comments. I think the next video might be covering the Ashes of War. So if you are interested in that, please do like and subscribe. And also do follow me on Twitch because I am live there every single day. I'm in the middle of doing a level 1 run. Actually almost finished it. So if you actually do want to see the ending of that, give me a follow there. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.